Today, I want to answer a question that has haunted me for over 20 years. How can the world of Genesis and the world of evolution describe the same creation when they seem to point in completely opposite directions? Because if creation is truly good, as Genesis insists, then evolution's long history of struggle, extinction, and suffering presents a germane problem far deeper than most of us can admit. When you look honestly at the natural world, it doesn't resemble a creation untouched by ruin. Every fossil layer, every extinction event, every predatory adaptation seems to tell the same story, one of struggle and loss, a world that survives only by devouring itself. What theological story can make any sense of this dynamic? The answer, I've come to believe, is that evolution unfolded inside a creation already wounded, already bent out of shape by a cosmic rebellion that took place before the first human ever drew breath. Evolution is brutal not because God designed its brutality, but because the visible world bears the scars of an invisible fall. The fall, that is, of the angels. And if that's true, then Genesis and evolution don't need to compete. They're describing two sides of the same fracture. So before we go any further, we need to understand the stories we're dealing with. Let's take stock of the two origin stories. The religious story is in Genesis, and it goes something like this. The cosmos is an intentional act formed over 6 days, days that may stretch across long ages. The first humans are fashioned from the clay of the ground and the breath of their creator around 10,000 years ago. They live in communion with God until, through the serpent's deception, they rebel and enter a world of suffering and death. Indeed, some believe that the suffering and death in this world is because of the sin of these first two earthlings. The scientific story is starkly different. The universe emerges from a quantum event. Life climbs upward through eons of competition, mutation, natural selection, and extinction. Evolution creates and destroys with equal indifference. Humanity, in this telling, is over 200,000 years old, the final branch of a long evolutionary tree. Genesis describes suffering entering the world after humans rebel. Science describes suffering ingrained in life long before humans even appear. How can we reconcile these two vastly different visions of reality? Because when you try to take both of these origin stories seriously, not only do you get a hopeless mismatch between how old and how many first humans there are, but you also stumble on an inescapable question. How can a world that emerges from billions of years of violence ever be called good? Think about it. According to evolution, every species alive today exists only because countless others rose and fell before them. Evolution generates diversity at the cost of astronomical suffering. And if God used evolution to create, how can we meaningfully call that creation or even that process good? Now, I want both to be true because picking a side felt too shallow. In school, people told me to just dismiss Genesis. It was a myth, a poem with no historical weight. But something in me resisted that. Human beings don't preserve stories for thousands of years unless they carry something essential and true. On the other side were people who told me to ignore the scientists. Dinosaur bones were Satan's props, designed to trick the world into doubting the Bible. Of course, that explanation didn't sit well with me either. Scientists aren't conspiring against God, they're trying to describe the world as they find it. They may miss the spiritual dimension, but they, generally speaking, don't fabricate the data. But one day, a new question came to my mind. Where did the serpent in Genesis come from? Here was a corrupting influence that was ostensibly part of the created order, wreaking havoc on the good. And when I followed this thread cautiously, something strange began to happen. The cruelty of the world started to look less like the intentional design of God or the deliberate disobedience of Adam, and more like the consequences of corruption that pre existed both. And suddenly, more questions came up. If the universe groans, as St. Paul writes in Romans, what originally wounded it? If creation is good, what and when was it bent out of shape? The answers to these questions are to be found in a wholly other story, one that us Christians think already know, but haven't really thought through. It's an event that whispers through the opening chapter of Genesis. It's implied in the unexpected evening in day 1 and manifested in the odd absence of the word good on day 2. It's an event echoed in Isaiah's fallen morning star and in Jesus' own words about Satan falling like lightning. And what I've come to realize is that Genesis is not merely telling us that humans sinned, but that humans were born into a world already marked by an earlier rebellion. Evolution, the long, painful push of life against decay, is simply what a damaged creation looks like when it tries to survive in a post-angelic fall. And to make sense of all this, our first step is to try to understand the theology that evolution reveals. Evolution is the process by which populations of living organisms change over generations. Charles Darwin is the grandfather of evolutionary theory, but its seeds were planted as far back as Empedocles, a Greek philosopher living well before Christ. Decades before Darwin, it was the philosopher Herbert Spencer who arrived at evolution not just as a theory, but as a cosmic inevitability, that simple things tend to become complex things over time due to random separation of otherwise homogeneous substances, differential environmental conditions, and competition for finite resources. Evolution, in other words, seems so germane to so much of the way life looks and works. Picture a population of early wolves on the fringes of the last ice age. Some are slightly faster, some have thicker fur, some are better at smelling prey hiding beneath the snow. None of them know this, of course. Nature simply tests them, and the ones whose traits give them even the slightest advantage survive. Those traits then become the foundation for the next generation. Evolution, therefore, isn't a theory about monkeys turning to humans. It's about how these tiny differences add and subtract over millions of years, and how they eventually reshape a species. All it takes, really, is 3 ingredients. The first is variation, the second is inheritance, and the third is selection. As I said, there is little dispute within the scientific community because it is seen as logically impassable. It also happens to be supported by multiple independent lines of evidence from biology, genetics, geology, paleontology, and even mathematics. Now, no single fact proves it in isolation. Rather, it's the convergence of data which forms a coherent, predictive framework unmatched by any alternative scientific model. Instead of being defensive about evolution, we Christians should be radically accepting it because its theology reveals the kind of world we live in. A world where life survives only through relentless pressure, scarcity, competition, and death. Now that brings us back to the original question. Why would a good creation behave this way? Let's take a step back. Evolution, we mentioned 3 ingredients: variation, inheritance, and selection. It's really that third one that selects the winners and losers in the game of life. Variation and inheritance are part of the natural created order. They pose little theological or moral challenge because there's nothing fundamentally deathly about them. Selection is where all the problems start and end. It happens because the world cannot possibly sustain all the variation that can be inherited. The world is hostile against most forms of life, And in that sense, evolution has a theology. It's the survival of the fittest. And the fittest are those that through hook or by crook win territory, resources, and mates. Evolution is the result of forces of life being assailed by the inevitabilities of their environment. A world that is, St. Paul said, groaning with suffering, groaning with pain. Now, before we dive into Genesis, I need to lay out my premises. First, Genesis is very old, older than most civilizations, and it carries truths that I think its first listeners and readers may not have fully consciously realized. That is to say, we today might understand the scripture more than those who originally received it or promulgated it. This isn't an unorthodox way of understanding scripture, by the way. Scripture is often understood most fully only in hindsight. Even Christ says that some commandments were given because of the people weren't ready for the real thing. Old Testament prophecies only make sense in light of the revelation of Christ in the New Testament. Secondly, I think old stories must be taken seriously. Stories that survive thousands of years aren't accidents. They last because they carry something essential and true. Taking Genesis seriously means stepping out of our modern assumptions of what it ought to mean. And one of those assumptions is that Genesis tells a single creation story. Here's the thing though, it doesn't. It actually tells two. And the rest of the Bible echoes them in very different ways. Take all these examples in the book of Psalms. Take these in the book of Isaiah. Genesis has two creation accounts, one running from Genesis 1:1 to verse 4 in chapter 2, the rest running from that verse onward to the end of the chapter. Genesis 1's opening salvo is glorious. It's one of the most philosophically dense pieces of literature ever produced. And when you slow down and actually read the first few verses word for word, little seams and oddities start to appear. Details modern readers gloss over because we assume we already know the story. Now, let's take the start. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Let's pause for a moment. If you go back to the word created, it's a very unique word in the Hebrew language. The word is bara, and it's only used a handful of times in the Old Testament to connote God's creative action here and with humanity. It means creating something entirely new from nothing. There is no precondition. It is truly ex nihilo. It's in sharp contrast to the term for making, which is used later, and a term used for purposeful manufacture. As we continue reading, something strange also opens up. Genesis splits reality into two realms right from the get go: heaven above, earth below. Day 2 explains how this division took place, but it raises a question. Why does God choose to divide reality at all like this? God creates light and calls it good, the first thing ever called good. But immediately after that, something strange happens. There's this evening and morning. It's strange because in a universe with no sun, no moon, no stars, where does the evening come from? Clearly, something happens between the creation of light and the arrival of day 2, something that introduces a cycle of morning and evening into time itself. Let's read from verse 6. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and separated the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. Now, most people assume that the firmament here is just the sky, but Genesis hasn't created a sky or an earth yet. That's as clear to us as it would have been to the first expositors, writers, listeners, and editors of Genesis. Something deeper is happening. Here's another thing. Day 2 also happens to be the only day God does not call good. Read the entire chapter for yourself if you don't believe me. It's the only day defined entirely by separation, and that day is not good. Now, let's go back to the firmament for a second. The Hebrew word firmament is rakia, which means something stretched out like a vast dome. In Genesis, it marks a boundary. Above the boundary is God's realm. Below it is the physical realm. It's our realm. Now, that divide shouldn't exist in a perfectly unified creation. Something had already disturbed the order necessitating this firmament. And when you place that alongside the rest of scriptures, a strange possibility begins to emerge, one that most modern Christians have never even considered. The fall of Lucifer is a very shadowy event in the Bible. Satan himself is elusive and shifty. The first time we meet the so-called Ha-Satan is in the book of Job, moving among the divine council. It's not entirely clear whether he belongs there or not, but his motive is unquestionable, and it is to question, to undermine and introduce doubt, such that it might be in the mind of God. Ha-Satan is a powerful creature. He's able to inflict diseases and acts of God on creation, but only with God's permission. He is the accuser. That's his job. Later on, he reappears in 1 Chronicles 21:1, inciting David to perform an illegal census. But beside a few other appearances here and there throughout the scripture, he isn't spoken about much, at least not in the Old Testament. The serpent in Genesis only becomes explicitly identified as Satan much later in the history of Judaism. There's nothing explicit in the text itself that the serpent in Genesis 3 is actually the devil. That connection appears later in Jewish writings like the Wisdom of Solomon 2:24, and then an early Christian interpretation. We have to get comfortable with the idea that scripture often becomes clearer in hindsight, and I mentioned this earlier, that we today sometimes understand earlier texts better because of what later revelation makes visible. One of the most enigmatic passages that follow this formula, where it's only later interpreted as referring to Satan, comes from Isaiah. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Son of the dawn. It's beautiful prose, but think of its implications. The dawn, the morning, eventually gives birth to the evening. The day star mentioned here is Venus, the planet Venus, that is, which rises right before the dawn and disappears the moment the sun rises. It's a light that tries to precede the true light, but collapses back into darkness the moment it appears. It's a fall of light within the light, a pattern of a broken morning. That's exactly the pattern that Genesis hints at. God creates light, he calls it good, and suddenly evening intrudes. The first morning is broken by the morning star. Isaiah and Genesis are describing the same cosmic event, a fall at the dawn of creation. And this is where we get the Latin Lucifer, light bearer, from. Christ later makes this connection in the Gospels more explicit and even connects Satan with serpents and scorpions. In this passage, the disciples return rejoicing that the demons are subject to them, and Jesus responds, and he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. The word Christ uses for lightning is astrape, from aster, meaning a star. He is identifying the one who fell. Christ is speaking of the collapse of the morning star. Light is created on day one, and with that light comes the firmament, the great dividing dome that separates heaven above from earth below. And into that new creation, a catastrophe strikes. Lucifer falls, the morning star becomes an evening shadow. His descent tears at the unity of creation. He turns dawn into dusk, and the boundary between heaven and earth becomes sealed. The fall of Satan is not merely a rebellion, it's the first fracture in the cosmos, the moment when creation itself shudders and light is forced to divide. What does Satan's fall do to creation? Cut off from the source of existence, Satan still exists, but as something twisted inward, something that consumes rather than radiates. Going back to our star metaphor, imagine Satan as a collapsed star, a black hole. Think of it as entropy, the relentless tendency of order to decay unless it is renewed. Satan is the personification of that principle, a being who once reflected God's order, but now unravels it. He doesn't create anything new, but he distorts what already is there. By falling out of heaven, which has now been separated from the earth by the firmament, he can act within the visible realm, sabotaging whatever God is creating in the visible realm. What Satan brings through his fall is the concept of corruption and of decay. Satan is not an equal and opposite reaction to God. He's not a force. In the same way, entropy is not a force. It's a statistical inevitability. It's chaos itself. If you want to think about what this personification looks like, we can look at the Joker from The Dark Knight. The Joker wants nothing to do with anything except scramble. He wants to create chaos. He wants to upset people's expectations. That's why he's such a brilliantly written character, because he taps into a collective subconscious understanding of the true nature of evil. It has no motive. It has nothing to strive for, except in what it strives against. And this is the world God continues to shape in days 2 through 6, a creation underway while corruption is already at work beneath the firmament. God forms and fills, and Satan distorts and erodes. Life begins in a universe touched by decay. In a world like that, life cannot simply unfold. It has to struggle, adapt, compete, persist against the entropy pressed into creation. And what is that long story of struggle but evolution itself? Yet even this is only the first consequence of Satan's fall. The fracture in creation will widen. Another fall, this time involving heaven's own sons, will alter the course of human history. By the time we get to the second chapter of Genesis, the outside world has already experienced billions of years of evolution. It's the world we've been describing all along, full of danger, competition, and decay. It's where the saber-toothed tiger and the dinosaur used to roam. We are still digging up the remnants of Genesis 1. But in Genesis 2, we find ourselves in a very different place. We are thrust into a walled sanctuary, a protected realm unlike anything in the universe. It's known as Eden, and it's a garden where human beings, freshly created out of the mingling of God's own breath with the clay of the ground, can live forever. If, that is, they remain within its boundaries and eat of the tree of life. Eden sits at the intersection of four rivers. Scholars can't really make sense of it though, because it's sort of like saying I live at the intersection of the Amazon, the Nile, the Ganges, and the Yangtze. When you read about those four rivers, you'll realize that while two intersect, the other two are nowhere near the Tigris and the Euphrates. So clearly something else is going on here. You see, Eden doesn't belong to ordinary Earth. I think it's a hybrid space. It's paradise. It overlaps between heaven and earth. Insulated sufficiently from the entropy unleashed outside the garden, Eden is a place where death has no jurisdiction. The world beyond it is wild, ancient, and scarred. That's where all those human-like organisms roam the earth, and all their ancestors. But inside Eden, Adam and Eve are preserved from that reality. But then something happens. A serpent enters the garden. I'd like to think he was allowed in. This serpent is not really a garden snake. He's more like a draconic tempter. This creature communicates. It opens the eyes of Adam and Eve. Interestingly, evolutionary theorists believe we, humans, evolved a sense of color to detect snakes in trees. Our knowledge to survive comes from, in some sense, the reptiles that we evolved with. Adam and Eve choose the temptation of knowledge. Their act shatters the insulated realm of immortality, and God's handcrafted humans are thrust into a landscape forged by billions of years of struggle. They step into the world of Genesis 1, a world marked by scarcity, predation, death, and evolutionary history brought on by the fall of Satan. God does not curse them with toil or pain as a magical sentence of sorts. He simply reveals the reality of the world that they are about to enter. A world broken by the first fall now meets the humanity broken by the second fall. A couple of chapters later, we are led into one of the strangest, most controversial passages in all of Scripture, Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Here's the RSV. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to their wives as they chose, then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, but his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Whoa. So many questions. Why does the narrative suddenly focus on these sons of God and daughters of men? Why bother pointing out that they're multiplying? If you look at Genesis 5, it's quite clear that there is plenty of multiplication already happening. It's a series of genealogies. And how do the Nephilim fit in all this? In the Greek, it's translated as the gigantes, the giants. Are those the same as the men of renown? Why does this moment, of all moments, trigger God's declaration that humanity had crossed a boundary it should have never crossed? Why are they suddenly described as flesh? And why are their years suddenly limited to 120? Now, I think Genesis 6 is the hinge between Edenic humanity and post-Edenic humanity. If we're reading Genesis 6 as a story shaped by two falls, then this moment becomes incredibly important. Now, there are three major interpretations of this passage, all of which are deeply unsatisfactory. The first is royal lineage theory. This is the idea that the sons of God are actually referring to kings or nobles intermarrying the daughters of men who are simply peasants. There's no reason to believe this in the text. The second is the Sethite versus Cainite theory. Essentially, the sons of God are the sons of Seth, and the daughters of men are indeed the daughters of Cain, and there's this intermingling between a godly and an ungodly line. Again, very little in the text to suggest this. The last one is supernatural theory, wherein the sons of God are interpreted as angels who are fallen and eventually interbreed with human beings. This one was a very popular interpretation in the early church fathers, principally because this is the interpretation in 1st Enoch, which is a deuterocanonical text used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but has since not deemed canonical by all the other churches. But there is a fourth possibility hiding in plain sight, one that makes sense of everything we've argued so far. And it's that the sons of God are the descendants of Adam, and the daughters of men are the hominids. When these two distinct lineages mix, we get the mighty men of renown, the giants, the Nephilim, us. This union is devastating to the Lord because he had intended humans to be a special creation, insulated from the ravaging forces of evolution. It's why he decries man as now flesh and pronounces that our days are limited to 120 years. His announcement isn't a prescription for a curse, but a description of a consequence. The sons of Adam in Genesis had lived to hundreds of years, but after the intermixing with hominids, we are now more caved in by the forces of evolution, shortening human lifespans to about 120 years. Modern man today is the byproduct of Adam's line mixing with the hominids. Interestingly, there's actually some evidence of human hominid interbreeding. About 5 to 10% of European DNA likely involved Neanderthals, a dead end. Meanwhile, 10% of Asian DNA can be traced back to Denisovans, and 20% of sub-Saharan African DNA to an as yet unidentified hominid. In other words, our stories are converging. Humans sit at the crossroads of Genesis 1 and 2, and if the cosmos itself had been torn by two great ruptures, the fall of the demons and the fall of humanity, then that fracture shouldn't just show up in our biology and in our history, it should show up in us, in the human interior, in the place where we experience ourselves most directly, our will, our desires, our moral life. And this really sets the stage for St. Augustine and the inner human struggle. Because with him, the divided cosmos becomes the divided will. There is a moment in St. Augustine's Confessions where he stops analyzing the world and finally turns inward. What he finds is not clarity but fracture. The human will, he realizes, is not a single unified force, but a field of conflict. This is a field that everyone from Plato onwards has described. Some people say it's the division between the mind and the heart. For someone like St. Augustine, you realize that a person can genuinely want what is good, yet simultaneously cling to what is destructive. This was the divided will. He feels two movements inside of him. One draws toward God, truth, simplicity. The other pulls him towards habit, pleasure, and the inertia of choices already made. It's not two literal wills, but rather one will that's torn apart. I can't think of a better scene that captures this divided will than Gollum in The Two Towers in The Lord of the Rings. In that moment by the stream, the camera splits him into two selves, Smeagol pleading for the good he dimly desires, and Gollum dragging him back into the patterns he cannot escape. It's really St. Augustine's Confessions rendered in cinema. It's the will pulled apart by competing loves and the self arguing with itself, exhausted by its own contradictions. Smeagol knows what he wants, Gollum knows what he craves, and the battle between them is so painful to watch. St. Augustine had long believed that knowledge would heal this tension, that if he simply understood what was true, philosophically, theologically, his actions would fall into place. Instead, he discovers a harsher truth, that will can commend itself and then fail to obey. A person can see the good with perfect clarity and still not do it. This realization convinced him the problem lay deeper than he thought. The line between good and evil, as Solzhenitsyn once said, runs through the art of every man. St. Paul talks about, I do not do the good I want to do. For St. Augustine, it was an abstraction. This is his autobiography. And it's so enduring because he refuses to treat this conflict as simple moral failure. It's not about discipline or advice. The will lacks the strength to unify itself. If the first fall wounded creation, the second fall wounded the human soul. Both our bodies and souls are beaten because we are the grandchildren of both falls. The cosmos was split outside of us, the will was split within us. St. Augustine's divided will is a testament to the human person's struggle to live with its wounded interior in an accursed universe. In the outer world, we inherit the wound of Lucifer's fall. In the inner world, we inherit the wound of Adam's. Creation is divided, and so are we. Why does a good God create a world in a fallen universe? Why does he continue to create in a world that had already succumbed to the fall of the morning star, where he knows that there's going to be billions of years of predation, extinction, decay, and the horrors of human history, everything up until the gulags and the gas chambers? Now, part of why we find these concepts so hard to grapple with is in our assumptions about who God is. In classical Western theology, God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. But taken together, these attributes create a fundamental tension. If God is all-loving, that love must allow for freedom. And if that freedom is real, then God must, in some sense, restrain his power. A love that overwhelms at the point of a pistol isn't love, it's compulsion. Love has to make space for the beloved to respond. This idea is not unique to Christianity. In Kabbalistic Judaism, for example, there is this secret notion of the Tzimtzum, the idea that before anything existed, there was only God. And for anything else to exist, God had to withdraw, creating a kind of metaphysical negative space in which creation could unfold. God had to open up a world of negative space where he doesn't exist, nor to create something that wasn't him. Creation requires God to make room. Christianity, of course, has a specific version of this insight. The God of Scripture is not some solitary point of consciousness, but a communion of Father, Son, and Spirit, whose very being itself is relational. Creation is not just the act of a lonely monad, but the overflowing generosity of a triune life interacting with itself. Generosity always involves self-giving and a willingness to hold back, to let the other be. Divine withdrawal is the outer expression of who God eternally is, a life that creates space for relationships. Creation began with a gift, God making room for something other than himself. Generosity is always self-giving, always a kind of holy restraint, a love that says, you may exist, you may choose, you may love me freely. But the space that makes love possible also makes distortion possible. When an angelic will curved inward, creation absorbed the shock. When a human will followed the same path, the fracture deepened. The universe groaned under entropy, the human heart groaned under division. Two falls, one cosmic, one human, left the world aching for repair. And so the question was never simply, why does God allow suffering? The deeper question is, how far will God go to heal what freedom has broken? The entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is God's answer to that question. A God who makes room for creation is also a God who refuses to leave creation alone in its ruin. He steps into the very gap his love allowed, into the decay, the brutality, the torn fabric of nature, and the torn fabric of the human soul. He enters the wound, he bears its full weight. He lets the fracture pierce him, and on a Roman cross the Creator meets his broken creation, and the two falls begin to come undone. In that moment, the moment you're seeing now, the wound that began before Eden meets the love that began before time. Christ takes into himself the corruption that bent the universe, the rebellion that scarred the earth, the death that haunted every creature who has ever lived. And when he breathes his last, the ancient powers that fed on decay lose their claim. The one who fell first, the one who twisted creation into a theater of suffering, he realizes he struck the only blow that will heal the world. Love has entered the place where freedom went wrong, and love has not broken. That's why, in the old Christian imagination, the devil doesn't laugh at the cross, he screams, because the moment Christ falls silent, the cosmos begins to breathe again. The sun rises, the light returns, and a new creation breaks through the old. The resurrection is imminent, but the victory is already won. In this costly act of divine self-giving, in this moment when God descends into the very entropy that wounds the universe and turns death inside out. So when we look at evolution, at Genesis, and at the divided human heart, we're not seeing contradictions, we're seeing wounds that are healing. When we look at the cross, we're seeing the one who enters those wounds to close them forever. The world still groans, but now it groans like something being restored, like a creation remembering what it's meant to be, like a universe learning, at last, to rise.